Tag, mein Freunde. Ich bin Samuel. Willkommen. Greetings, friends. I'm Samuel. Last Sunday, the far-right Freiheitlich Party Österreich became the largest party in the Austrian parliament. So with the Nazis potentially back in power in Vienna, I thought I would talk about the relation between the Holocaust and autism. In this video, we are going to talk about eugenics and the Nazi ideology surrounding it. We are going to talk about how it affected disabled and mentally ill people, and what effect this had on the genesis of research on autism. Looking at how parts of Nazi ideology has permeated into modern science and medical thought. When I say that the FPO are Nazis, I'm not being hyperbolic. They were literally founded by Anton Weidholler, who is described as an SS officer, which is really an understatement, as he served in the Nazi Austrian cabinet before the Anschluss under Seyss Inquart, who would go on to be Hans Frank's deputy in Poland. Reinholder also served as a junior minister in the German government before being granted an honorary position equivalent to a brigadier in the SS. The second leader, Friedrich Peter, ran the party until 1978 and was active until 1992, was also an SS officer and was a member of the Einsatzgruppen. Their current leader aspires to be the Volkskanzler, the same title used by this product of incest. He has spoken at rallies with neo-Nazis and Holocaust deniers, and is broadly Islamophobic and pro-Putin. Now, I want to talk about what happened to autistic people the last time the Nazis were the largest party in Vienna. The Nazis' social Darwinism is generally understood as the regime's idea that the so-called Aryan race, made up of German and Nordic peoples, was superior to other races of people, and that paradoxically they were also threatened by other races such as Jewish people, Slavs, and African people. The irony being, as Tolkien pointed out in 1938, when asked by German publishers who wanted to publish The Hobbit whether he was Aryan, that Aryan people are actually Indo-Iranian and not German. The Nazis believed, in line with many eugenicists, in the inevitability of a race war which would result in the survival of the fittest. This was not a new idea. A conflict between the Teutonic people and Slavs was often worried about in the run-up to the First World War, and arguably contributed to the German decision to mobilize against Russia in August 1914. Nor was this idea confined to Germany. Eugenic societies could be found across the great powers, and in fact, eugenics originated in Britain with Galton, a cousin of Darwin, who created a pseudoscience of race-based intelligence, or as he called it, hereditary genius, based almost entirely on his own personal prejudices, ranking Aboriginal Australians at the bottom and ancient Greeks at the top, reflecting the social hierarchy of the time rather than any actual data, especially as his work predates Mendel's gene theory. Eugenics continued to be popular in Britain until the end of the Second World War. Figures such as John Maynard Keynes became the director of the British Eugenics Society between 1937 and 1944. The Nazis believed that in order to win this race war, the German people needed to have lots of soldiers and therefore lots of children. The law for the encouragement of marriage gave newlywed couples 1,000-mark loans, and 250 marks was written off for each child, and military-style medals were given to women corresponding to the number of children they had. But Hitler's obsession with racial purity meant that even among Germans there was a certain criteria to be met. He stated that the Germans should apply the logic of breeding horses and dogs to themselves and should be of pure blood. And yes, we will talk about the irony of J.K. Rowling teaching us all about tolerance and fighting an ideology straight out of Mein Kampf, only to turn around 20 years later and deny that one of the first Nazi book burnings happened, when we talk about autism and gender another time. Anyway, this Death Eater-esque ideology would materialize as the Lebensborn, which was a breeding program between members of the SS and Aryan girls and women designed to create a racial elite, which during the Second World War also kidnapped thousands of children from occupied territories to be raised by German parents. On the other side of this coin of blood purity is racial cleansing. I would like to just say at this point that Hitler is just really bad at writing a coherent argument and just consistently fails to make his point. And I'm having to avoid filling in the gaps so I don't put any credence into his unsubstantiated rants. So Hitler rambled that when Aryans have children with other people, and I'm cleaning up the language a bit here, that the Aryan race is weakened. He provides a half-baked example of the difference in the ethnic makeup of the US, where Hitler perceived the Teutons as dominating the continent, in comparison to Latin America, which is more mixed race in the 1920s. This was not an idea invented by Hitler. During the 1910s and early 20s, there are a number of books by Americans like Madison Grant who stated that the Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians were really Nordic all along, and that Nordics were in the process of committing a racial suicide by having children with other ethnic groups. The takeaway from this rambling mess for our purposes, in Hitler's words, is the idea that physical and mental degeneration is the result of miscegenation, which weakens the race, which leads to the assumption that disability is the result of having impure blood, of not quite being Aryan enough, or as a Deaf Eater might say, mudblood. The Nazis heavily emphasized the collective over the individual. A key aim of the regime was to build what was called the Volksgemeinschaft, which roughly translates as the people's community. The Volksgemeinschaft was meant to replace identity based in class or religion with an ethnic nationalism. Race became deified, sacred, and became a symbol of national unity, linking every member to each other. And what made somebody a member of the Volk was their blood, their collective blood, linked together by the territory on which it lives, classically known as blood and soil. Of course, Nazi ideology isn't exactly consistent. What was considered German territory was flexible, to say the least. It didn't just include the territory of the 19th century German Confederation and Prussia, which already included significant minorities of Czechs and Poles. In fact, much of the reasoning behind Operation Barbarossa was not just to fight this race war or to fight communism, but to provide agricultural land or Lebensraum for German people in the modern-day Ukraine and Belarus to support a growing population. The Nazis planned to starve to death 30 million people and relocate the people of Eastern Europe beyond the Ural Mountains. This expansion east for Lebensraum is something that Hitler had been planning since 1924 and can be found in the second volume of Mein Kampf. If the soil was flexible, blood certainly wasn't. The Nuremberg laws were based on the Jim Crow laws and forbade marriage between ethnic Germans and Jewish people, but also Romani people and people of African descent. Starting in 1933, the Nazis began a program of forced sterilization of men and women who were feeble-minded, schizophrenic, bipolar, epileptic, had dementia, were blind, deaf, physically deformed, or even alcoholic. Over the 12 years the Nazis were in power, 400,000 Germans were sterilized against their will. These sterilizations were also enforced illegally on mixed-race Germans who were the children of French colonial troops and African Americans who had been occupying the Rhineland after the First World War. Again, this view of disability tied to eugenics was not without precedent or exclusively German. In 1908, the Royal Commission established by Arthur Balfour on the care and control of the feeble-minded recommended compulsory detention for those who were considered mentally inadequate and sterilization of the unfit. This idea of sterilization was carried forward by Churchill in his capacity as Home Secretary. In 1910, he wrote to the Prime Minister recommending sterilization over detention on the basis that it would be more humane and liberal. But in the meantime, mentally ill people should be segregated. This was clearly based on eugenic ideas. He wrote, "I am convinced that the multiplication of the feeble-minded, which is proceeding now at an artificial rate, unchecked by any old restraints of nature, is a very terrible danger to the race." Although in the end no law was passed to this effect, a private member's bill, the Feeble-Minded Control Bill, would have made it illegal to marry a so-called mentally defective person, and required segregation, and gave the Home Secretary the power to detain anyone who didn't meet the definition at their own discretion, and this bill had wide public even from the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, as well as H.G. Wells. In a similar fashion, in the early 20th century, a number of US states passed laws which required the forced sterilization of mentally ill people, and between 1907 and 1981, 65,000 people were sterilized. The policy of forced sterilization was upheld in the US Supreme Court, Buck v. Bell, 1927, with the Chief Justice declaring, "3 generations of imbeciles is enough." What made the Nazis exceptional from the Anglo-Saxon world was a program of systematic murder of children known as Aktion T4, run directly out of the Chancellery by Hitler's personal doctor and the equivalent of his chief of staff. Hitler gave a direct order in October 1939 to expand this systematic killing to adults. Reichleiter Baller and Dr. Brandt MD are charged with the responsibility of enlarging the authority of certain physicians to be designated by name in such a manner that persons who, according to human judgment, are incurable, upon a most careful diagnosis of their sickness, be accorded a mercy death. I think the fact that this order exists on paper, whereas Hitler's fingerprints are kept far away from the Wannsee Conference, demonstrate the extent to which the Nazi regime believed that it was justifiable and unlikely to harm their standing in international relations, which in terms of international law was unfortunately correct. Before Nuremberg, human rights law was in utero. The idea that external state parties might intervene on a state's treatment of its own citizens was considered to be a violation of sovereignty. This policy had its roots in Weimar Germany. Karl Breindin and Alfred Hook wrote a paper on allowing euthanasia in certain conditions in 1920. They argued that the value of a disabled person's life was worth less if the cost of caring for them was more than their contribution to society. They used phrases like life unworthy of living and useless eater, which would become a core part of the Nazi propaganda. This propaganda included maths textbooks, which would get students to calculate the money that might be saved by removing useless eaters. This policy of extermination was based on the idea of restoring racial integrity by killing people who had psychiatric, neurological, or physical disabilities, as they were considered to be a financial burden on the state. The criteria for this program was broadly similar to conditions for sterilization. The Aktion T4 program worked with doctors referring patients to lethal injection centers and gas chambers which used carbon monoxide and then cremated the bodies. This was done in secret, but soon became public knowledge, and by August 1941, public pressure forced Hitler to stop the gassing of Germans after over 70,000 people were already dead. Despite being officially halted, the program continued widely through lethal injection in 30 different hospitals across the Reich, and the criteria were expanded to also include frail elderly people, soldiers with disabilities, or combat injuries, and in one hospital in Bavaria, practice developed of slowly starving patients to death by reducing their calorie intake over several weeks. This program was established after the Anschluss, and so it also included Austria, and in 1939 there was one gas chamber and at least 4 lethal injection sites in the country. Throughout the war, 10,000 disabled children were murdered by lethal injection, and at least 80,000 psychiatric patients were murdered by the SS. In total, an estimated 300,000 people were murdered. Leo Alexander, after the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, wrote a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine called Medical Science Under Dictatorship. He put the total deaths of Aktion T4 at 275,000 people. Alexander believed that the systematic murder of disabled people under the Nazis was the wedge that opened the door to the wider Holocaust of Jews, Poles, and Russians, including the fact that Zyklon B was first used to gas disabled children. There is a very good book on the Aktion T4 program called The First Into the Dark, The Nazi Persecution of the Disabled, which you can get for free through JSTOR if you want to delve into this more. But as I said at the beginning, this episode is about the effect that these policies had on autism. Until 2013, what is now known as Autistic Spectrum Disorder 1 was called Asperger syndrome, after the Viennese doctor who is understood to have first diagnosed autism, first in a paper in 1938, and then more comprehensively in 1944. What is less well known about Hans Asperger is that as he was carrying out his research in Vienna, he was also complicit in the T4 Actium program. The impact of our understanding of autism of this scientist working under a regime built around eugenics is immense, and potentially has had extraordinary damage on how autistic people are perceived. For this part, I will mostly be using the works of Herwig Czech, who has written a comprehensive article on this, and Edith Schaeffer's book, Asperger's Children, The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna. These are the two main and basically only English language sources on this, so I hope they don't mind if I follow their narratives. So as Czech points out, Asperger has been the subject of a whitewash of history, which seems to reflect modern society's attitudes to autism. The 1991 book by Jutta Frith seems to praise Asperger for caring about children who everyone else would have seen as obnoxious brats, and painted an image of him working to protect autistic children and played down the influence of Nazi ideology on his work. However, throughout the Nazi regime in Vienna, Asperger was consistently approved of by the Gestapo despite his Catholicism. He survived the purge of politically unacceptable civil servants. He passed scrutiny of the body designed to screen lecturers for ideas contrary to National Socialism, which, when you consider that 2/3 of the doctors in Vienna and 70% of the paediatricians lost their jobs after the Anschluss, really raises some eyebrows. In the first paper ever written about autism in 1938 are the lines, "The central idea of the new Reich, that the whole is more than its parts, and that the Volk is more important than the individual." He goes on to state that the physicians ought to comply with the sterilisation laws. So the question of whether Asperger protected his patients is murky. While he was accurate in pointing out the genetic nature of autism, doing so put his patients at risk from eugenicists. In the same way, Asperger's assessment of patients he deemed high-functioning was significantly worse than non-autistic patients. He saw them as having mixed worthiness, described autistic originality as useless, and made a direct and inaccurate link to schizophrenia, which, as I have already talked about, was a death sentence. The various quotes which might be given to show that Asperger advocated helping abnormal children did not fall foul of the Nazi regime. Czech argues that Asperger was ambivalent to the sterilisation laws and sometimes helped patients and sometimes not. But what he did do is send children to Spiegelgrund, one of the lethal injection sites. This included a 3-year-old girl called Herta Schreiber who had encephalitis. Asperger wrote, and I quote, "The child must be an unbearable burden to the mother. Permanent placement at Spielgrund seems absolutely necessary." Asperger also sent a 5-year-old girl, Elizabeth, to Spiegelgrund after a mother asked for her to be institutionalized. Czech finds it implausible that Asperger was ignorant of the nature of the hospital. There were other incidents, such as when Asperger worked on the board of another hospital classifying the children. That board labelled 35 children as uneducable or unemployable, which was a euphemism for "kill these kids." And out of the 158 children they assessed, 37% ended up in Spiegelgrund. Czech summarizes this affair as, "In this case it seems that Asperger was a well-functioning cog in a deadly machine." Czech further questioned the Schindler of neurodiversity myth by looking at the files of the survivors of Spiegelgrund who had also been assessed by Asperger. Czech makes the point that Spiegelgrund staff would have been race hygienicists and committed Nazis. Out of the 30 cases where we have sufficient information, Asperger is only less harsh in his assessment in 2 cases, equally harsh in 16, and in 12 rated the children more harshly, including one case where Asperger diagnosed an autistic boy who was not yet 2.5 with intellectual retardation and a disturbed personality, and called him an unbearable burden and recommended Spiegelgrund. When he was at Spiegelgrund, Heinrich Gross saw improvement and gave the child back to its grandparents. For context, Heinrich Gross published articles after the war using data gathered from preserved brains of 400 children who were killed for being disabled or antisocial, which he kept until the 1980s. So if Gross was more willing to spare the life of an autistic child than Asperger, the myth falls apart really quickly. This series of events repeated itself with other prominent eugenicists in Asperger's orbit. Asperger's actual work on autism was significantly influenced by Nazi ideology. Zephyr makes the excellent point that what was being diagnosed by Asperger wasn't race or physiology, but the ability to conform to the community. The vitality of the Volk depended upon the ability of individuals to feel it, and that sociability itself became a form of persecution. Essentially, what autistic children lacked was Gemut, the sense of collectivism necessary for fascism. Essentially, the diagnosis came down to the likelihood of rejecting the Volksgemeinschaft. And I think this is true. As my parents will tell you, as a kid, I was a veritable Socrates, always asking why, questioning the most basic social assumptions, and we don't, generally speaking, subscribe to social traditions that we perceive as not having any merit. And I, at least, don't hold any allegiance to what Benedict Anderson termed an imagined community. The problem is that the term Gemut also means soul, and putting aside the very real risk of autistic children being killed by the state for their lack of conformity, the heavy influence of Nazi psychiatrists like Schroeder and Heinze led to Asperger misunderstanding autism on a fundamental level. Schroeder emphasized the importance of Gemut to the Volksgemeinschaft, echoing Biden and Hock's treatise on euthanasia, saying, "The degree of one's richness of Gemut is one of the most important determinants of the practical usefulness and social value of a person." Heinze described a lack of Gemut as lacking devotion, respect, a sense of community, compassion, and sympathy. Of course, Heinze also stated in an Orwellian manner that socialists and communists also lacked a sense of Gemut, which in his own definition he defined as a sense of community. How is one a socialist without a sense of community? I do not know. The very concept of an autistic spectrum seems to have originated with Heinze and his discussion of the different levels of Gemut and intellectual abilities among children. But if this is tainted by fascist ideology, as the term high functioning was, the definition of autism is infected by the requirements of the Nazi regime for social cohesion. Asperger writes about the spectrum in the context of traits that the Nazis would find useful. He said that this spectrum went from the highly original genius through the weird eccentric who lives in a world of his own and achieves very little, down to the most severe, contact disturbed, automaton-like, mentally retarded individual. While Asperger envisaged some autistic children as capable of being academics, STEM enthusiasts, and civil servants, he considered the negative traits to outweigh the positive traits in most cases. Further down the spectrum, Asperger described autistic people as robots with little social value, who are incapable of social feeling, and considered autistic people to be unable to be an integral part of the world and unable to learn. When most people refer to somebody being on the spectrum, which they consider as going from the most autistic to not autistic at all, leading to the common idiom that everyone is a little bit autistic. Not only is that incorrect, but the real original spectrum determined whether or not an autistic person should be considered worthy of life on the basis of their perceived usefulness to society as a whole. Asperger, in a very real sense, recommended that most autistic people should be subject to the T4 Aktion program. Asperger wrote his paper on autistic psychopathy in 1944 in Nazi-controlled Vienna at the height of its totalitarianism. The title in and of itself is extremely harmful and inaccurate, and it spawned so many myths about a lack of empathy. If anything, our empathy can be overwhelming. As a kid, I cried because Uncle Ira on Avatar The Last Airbender was crying over spilling the best tea in Ba Sing Se, which completely confuddled my dad, completely didn't understand it. So we will do a deep dive on empathy and autism another time. In some ways, Asperger seems vindictive against autistic children, labelling them as sadistic. He declared that acts of malice were characteristic of autism. He further describes the children as spiteful and that the children's cruelty emerged from a lack of Gemut. In my opinion, the problem with this is the concept of Gemut had become so consumed by the doctrines of National Socialism that the logic had become not that children were cruel, malicious, and therefore perhaps lacked Gemut, but rather, because they lacked the Gemut necessary for the Volksgemeinschaft, they must be cruel and malicious. In the 1944 paper, Asperger both says that autistic people have a different form of Gemut and lack it entirely. The individualistic traits of autism are demonized to correspond with the governing ideology. He describes autistic children as aliens who are cut off from their environment, alone in the world, among people as if a stranger. In some ways, this is remarkably prescient of the chronic loneliness that autistic people can feel. But it was not meant to be sympathetic, and in a society where it was quite literally conform to the collective or be killed, this was a deadly indictment. Asperger also had a serious problem with misogyny. Sheffer tells the tale of two boys and two girls in Asperger's clinic who had very different outcomes. Fritz, Harrow, Elfriede, and Margaret. Doctors in the ward noticed some classic autistic traits in the girls, such as misreading social cues or resistance to peer pressure. They also described the boys and girls as having similar attitudes to arbitrary authority and ignorance on nuances of informal versus formal communication. They also demonstrated traits like talking at length about special interests and having a well-developed vocabulary, although the doctors consistently talked about these traits in much nastier tones than I am, especially about the girls. The doctors also described all of them as being oversexed, which wasn't something to get into because, quite frankly, I don't know how you would start with that. With the boys, Asperger recognised autism and actively developed a program to support Fritz. For example, he recommended that he should have teaching assistants and recommended that caregivers develop emotional attachments, and that by doing so, that this roots could be transferred or taught. Again, this shows how Nazi ideology influenced the end aim of helping autistic children to make them more focused with the community. With the girls, Asperger literally blamed their behaviour on their periods and did not give them a diagnosis. Miss Burgess's dismissal of Elfriede led to her being considered uneducable and being sent to Spiegelgren regardless of her intelligence. Margaret ended up being sent to Spiegelgren twice by Asperger, who at one point directly introduced her to Jekelius, the head of Spiegelgren. In the 1944 paper, Asperger claimed in 10 years to have worked with 200 autistic children and have never met an autistic girl. He even stated that while he recognized autistic traits in the boys' mothers and that girls had traits which he recognized as being like autism, he just put this down to hormones. Like he was clearly blinded by his own misogynistic assumptions. He considered that abstract intelligence was a key feature of autism, which he did not think that girls were capable of. He believed in a fundamental sex difference in intelligence between men and women, where abstraction was exclusively male and female thought was the result of feelings and instincts, and even said that the autistic personality is an extreme variant of male intelligence. Sheffer also suggested that there may have been class considerations in how Asperger diagnosed autism. Asperger perceived Harrow and Fritz to be more upper class and therefore eccentric, whereas Elfriede and Margaret were working class, and the same traits were seen as mental illness. Asperger's decision to exclude girls from the diagnosis also had a long-term impact, which still leads to institutional underdiagnosis of girls and women today. Our basic understanding of autism emerged from this environment of Nazi Germany and continued to mess with our fundamental ideas about neurodiversity for decades. The eugenic practices of the Nazi state also continue to the modern day. The United States still carries out forced sterilizations. In 2014, California found that in its prison system, out of the 39 sterilizations that took place, 27 did not have the proper consent forms. Additionally, in 2020, ICE carried out 24 sterilizations in its detention centres. This especially seems to be a matter of racial cleansing. During COVID, triage decisions were made across Britain that actively discriminated against autistic people. In April 2020, the BBC reported that a GP in Somerset had sent a letter to an autism support group saying that autistic adults should have do not resuscitate plans in place in case they become critically ill. The COVID inquiry has been given evidence to suggest that this was common practice, even if it was not official government policy and was in breach of a number of laws. The NHS had to send a letter to all GPs and trusts that emphasised that learning difficulties or Down syndrome should never be a reason for a do not resuscitate order, and that healthcare for people with disabilities and autism should be made on an individual basis and should not be based on autism alone. Doctors seem to be actively introducing documents into patients' medical records, which gave instructions to not attempt to perform CPR, especially with people with Down syndrome, autism, and other learning difficulties. 60% of people who died between March and July 2020 were disabled. This was the result of autistic people and people with learning difficulties being considered clinically frail regardless of age and being denied access to the ICU. As I have explained before, autism and learning difficulties are not synonymous, but unfortunately the common schema, even among doctors, is different. It was also true that people with learning difficulties aged 18 to 34 were 30 times more likely to die of COVID than other people the same age. The same ideology used by the Nazis that a life has less value if its social contributions to society are less than the cost of caring for it, seems to have been applied in the triage system of COVID across multiple NHS trusts and far too many doctors. Now, I understand this has been a very long video, guys, and I've gone on some deep and dark topics, and I thank you for watching.